Hello and welcome back to our little show during which we forget all our troubles and go back to simpler times and play some of the PS2 classics. Man, it's been a while since my last video, hasn't it? If you want to ask someone how to not build momentum after a semi-successful effort from a literal nobody, you've come to the right place. Well, in my defense, there's been a lot happening in the past 2 months, including me finding a new job, dealing with power outages, and the Elden Ring DLC. So those who subbed after my previous video, please accept my apologies for taking my time. Still, my mission remains, and I will review those 20 games I mentioned in my previous video. Today's subject sure is a funny little title. It is called ONI, and it is a third-person action beat-em-up and a third-person shooter, released on January 2001 for Windows personal computers, Mac OS, and PlayStation 2, the latter version of which we'll be looking at today. Developed by Bungie, a video game company that is now best known among my peers for their famous genre and platform-defining series Halo, that honestly needs no introduction. To a fresher generation of gamers, the company is now better known for Destiny, another genre-defining franchise that, although not as iconic, but is still popular among the looter-shooter connoisseurs. Still, between the two, Halo is a much more iconic franchise in my book. Even I, a person who had first heard of Xbox as a brand only with the release of Xbox 360 and who'd never owned any platforms of the Xbox branding, know a lot about Halo. And considering how Bungie's brand was so strongly associated with Xbox back in my youth, it was very interesting to dig into their history for this project and find out how back in the 90s they were more known and beloved as a Mac OS first-person shooters provider, with Marathon being a beloved franchise among many classic Mac users. Yes, it only just clicked with me now that their newly developed Marathon is a reimagining of their classic franchise and not a brand new IP. Though we best know Bungie for their first-person shooter prowess, they always tried to diversify back in the day, as evident by the Myth series they'd worked on after Marathon, as well as ONI, the subject of our today's video. So, why is ONI among the 20 games I've selected for Season 1 of this show? If you missed my previous video about Berserk, which you should definitely check out by the way, the goal I had in mind with this series is to relive my youth and play seemingly cool video games that I missed out on in my teenage years. One aspect of my youth that I cherish is the fact that I rarely, if ever, knew much about a game before inserting it into my PS2's optical disc drive, and most of my preliminary judgments were based on the game's cover art. At this point some of you may not get what I'm talking about, so I'll tell you something about Ukraine, where I was born and raised, and how the technological advancements got into the late 90s and early 2000s. I can describe it in one single sentence. Most households didn't have internet until 2008. Sure, you could access the internet by going to this place called a computer club and pay $50 for approximately 40 minutes of stay. Most kids my age went there not to surf the web, but instead play a PC version of GTA Vice City, cooperate with your buddies in Counter-Strike 1.5, do a LAN match of Warcraft 3, or boot up a version of Max Payne with a bunch of Matrix-related mods that made it look like a proper licensed game, cause no one in your immediate vicinity knew anything about any Max Paynes. With the lack of easily accessible information about video games besides what your buddies may recommend, all we had to go off when we went to a video game store and picked a PS2 game was its cover and recommendation from a guy at the counter. And here I'll entertain you, my dear viewer, with another fun fact about my country. 99% of the consoles in Ukraine were sold pre-modded, because no average parent in a post-Soviet country would ever spend $60 on a stupid video game for their kid. So yes, you guessed it, all the video games that were sold in our stores were pirated bootlegged versions, often with very bad machine translation patched in to make it more approachable for the kids whose English knowledge was limited to a phrase "London is the capital of Great Britain." If you are wondering, the asking price for an average bootlegged PS2 game back in 2004 was around 25 Ukraine monies, which was worth about $5 US. Going back to ONI and its cover. Before starting this project, it always felt like I was being haunted by it. Whenever I entered some shady site to download an ISO of one of the Animusha games, it was always there next to it, staring at me. And let me tell you, if I was to see this game's cover back in my teenage years, it would surely leave one heck of impression on me. There's a girl, and she looks cool. Her hair looks like Wolverine's, and she has guts. There's a hint of a breast pushing against her arm, and she looks at you with determination to kill. Would you let her kill you? Next to her there's the game's name, ONI, which means demon in Japanese. I can assure you that being a kid, there's no way I would have guessed that some guy wrongly told one of this game's producers that Oni means ghost, which fitted their concept of the game's main character, hence why they went for that name. That's one funny anecdote, man. Based on this cover, I instantly made a number of assumptions, 3 to be exact. 1. This lady is our main protagonist, and she is some sort of cop. 2. This will be a third-person shooter. 3. This game is heavily Japanese inspired. There was another assumption flying in the air. Assumption may not even be the right word for it, more like a gut feeling. That this game is likely really bad and I will not enjoy my time with it. Throughout the years I learned to trust my video game's gut feeling, but I try to engage with it as open-mindedly as possible. What are the results? Let's find out. As you boot up the game, Oni greets you with an animated FMV, which has that typical 2000s AMV vibe, minus the AG 2000s music track in the background. Instead of that, the opening is full of our heroine's close-ups, with her face weirdly reminding me of Hide the Pain Harold. Then the menu greets us, and hey, it looks pretty stylish. Futuristic background, clean menu prompts with custom-shaped borders, proudly enlarged logo with a sleek gradient applied, and our main heroine? She looks somewhat different compared to what we've seen of her in the opening. In fact, even at a glance, they both look rather different from the cover's art style. This kept happening throughout my journey with this game. Our protagonist, whose name is Konoko, kept being portrayed in vastly different art styles depending on the context. Her in-game depiction, for example, closely resembles PS1-era Lara Croft's boobs, as in she's made of sharp corners. When she's speaking with someone on the phone, her portrait makes her look like she jumped out straight out of the Tick cartoon. The art style on the loading screens are all over the place, while the game over arts are something that more closely resembles the style that we saw on the cover. Wait, what is Leon S. Kennedy doing here? If you were hoping for a truly stylized anime-like experience, this game misses the mark. Sure, it is inspired by the likes of Ghost in the Shell, but artistically, structurally and writing-wise, Oni is much closer to a typical superhero Sunday morning cartoon straight out of Fox Kids, rather than an anime-inspired piece of media akin to the Avatar. Heck, I'd even argue that shows like Totally Spies and Teen Titans turned out more anime-inspired and took the best from the media compared to this game. By the way, did you hear that my 3 girlfriends have returned with a new season of their show? Heck yeah! If any of this video's viewers coincidentally work at Zodiac Kids, hey, I'm ready to shill for your show, so feel free to sponsor me and my next 18 episodes, so I can quit my daily job and become a full-time YouTuber. This will help these videos to not take an eternity to make as well, so it's a win-win situation for all of us. Accompanied by funky music's beats, I selected the new game option on the menu, and the game threw me into the tutorial space, proudly called Chapter 00. Combat Training Module 1-A. Okay, 2 things right off the bat. These reflections on the shoulder pads and the backpack thingy are hella sexy for a 2001's PS2 game. And yeah, the voice acting in this game is pretty lame.
I'm so excited. Commander Griffin has authorized us to run through TCTF training program Beta 6.
Meet Shinatama, our Robogirl operator who will be assisting us during our missions. Among all the few things this game has thrown at us so far, she carries the largest volumes of anime, both in her name and design. Except for her hairstyle, which to me really gives away her American roots. I gotta say, that hairstyle is classy. It comes straight out of the 80s Hollywood action movies, and me likey them 80s Hollywood action movies. Before being deployed on a field mission, we are tasked to complete a tutorial, which involves doing all the basic action maneuvers this game has. The first one is dashing, and it's super weird and inconsistent when trying to do it with your analog stick. To do it, you have to double tap the forward direction, but because of the input buffer as well as the game's severe frame rate issues, doing it with your left analog is often very unreliable. To the point that trying to do it that way resulted in me catching several game overs during segments where dashing was required, so I quickly learned to only attempt this mechanic using the D-pad, which is thankfully also used for movement in this game. I bet the developers had the best intentions trying to implement it that way, likely being inspired by Streets of Rage 3. However, for a 3D game, that just doesn't cut it. You can say all you want about having to press the left analog stick to initiate the run nowadays, but trust me when I say we should all be thankful that this game's mechanical implementation of running didn't become a norm. While performing the dashing exercise, the game warned me that the sound of dashing would alert anyone in my vicinity. I shivered. This game likely has stealth, and if it's the game's main focus, then it will be close to unbearable for me, given that I'm very bad at this type of games, even at those having the most sophisticated examples of stealth mechanics. Trying to wave off the thought, I completed the tutorial. The remaining tasks comprise of pretty basic movement and combat techniques. You have your crouching, you have your jumping. You can crouch during the jumps for minor platforming challenges. You can also crouch during the dash, making our Wolverine-haired warrior slide and kick the foes out of their footing. You can side roll, cartwheel backwards, and use your R1 and R2 buttons to punch and kick your enemies. Stringing together punches and kicks results in different combo moves. The game doesn't teach you this, but during the fights you can taunt your enemies.
Floor around the drum.
Show me what you got.
Unfortunately, this action doesn't raise your style meter due to its absence, but it's still funny to do it.
You're gonna get beat by a girl.
Whoa, that's too sexist, lady. There are also grabs and they are somewhat strange. You have to be next to your opponent and hit the direction towards them plus either kick or punch, as if it were some sort of Guilty Gear entry. This mechanic didn't turn out very reliable, as very often a regular attack came out instead. Still, compared to many simplistic 3D brawlers of that era, this game had an okay amount of combat options, considering that you can also shoot with your guns. Speaking of, as the game teaches you during the tutorial, you can only hold one gun at a time, and aiming with your analog stick in this game is not easy. Wait, do I smell false advertisement here? On the game's cover, our main protagonist is prominently featured holding two guns in both her arms, with the third one being packed behind her back. Now the game tells me I can carry only one? Bungie, get your act together. Well hey, at least it means I was off the mark with one of my assumptions of this game being a third-person shooter. It in fact turned out to be more of a brawler-focused game, which I honestly prefer. As I went on through the tutorial, an interesting thing caught my eye. After jumping over some crates, Konako saw her look-alike, who seemingly was also undergoing a training session and battling some android-looking enemies. Mechanically wise, it was a smart foreshadowing because up to that point we hadn't faced any enemies yet, so this was our peek into how the battles play out. Even more interestingly, it made me wonder, what did Konako think of this? Seeing her carbon copy through the window. Is she a mass-produced robot? Does she possess any knowledge about it? This was the point where the game got me kinda hooked on its premise. And the fascinating thing is that it made me do so during the gameplay section without any dialogues or cutscenes. Letting these thoughts aside, we are pushed into our first proper mission. Our job here is to infiltrate a syndicate warehouse, which the baddies are using for storing goods of ill kind. One of the undercover agents from our side failed to report, so our duty is to find them and gather evidence that would allow us to shut down the syndicate's activities. As soon as the mission starts, the game gives away another mechanic that wasn't covered in the tutorial, the healing system. To loosely quote Joseph Anderson, who will never ever release his Witcher 3 video, games live and die by their healing systems. ONI utilizes a health pickup system with health items called hyposprays, being randomly dropped by the defeated enemies, found across the maps, or given to you by the NPCs, whom you manage to save from the baddies.
Show me what you got!
Given the infrequent checkpoints, this implementation of the healing system brings some downfalls, which will become more evident at a later stage. For now, armed with that knowledge, we start exploring the level and it looks quite basic. Flat textures and square shapes everywhere, that glorious early PS2 years galore minus the charm. Some rooms in the area legitimately gave off a mental hospital's padded rooms vibe, which doesn't really align with the whole cyberpunky atmosphere I thought this game was going to have. In any case, after going downstairs from our starting position, we encounter our first enemy. I honestly did try the stealth approach, but unsurprisingly it didn't work. Never works for me, man. And we beat the crap out of him. Wait a minute. I heard that sound clip somewhere. After beating the enemy unit, we gather some intel from the terminal. And as you might have guessed, terminals are the main world-building tool of this game. Sometimes they lay out quite interesting concepts and ideas that the writers had in their mind when building this game. But unfortunately, these ideas are rarely, if ever, reflected in the actual environments or the enemies, and I've always been in the camp of those who prefer the concept of show, don't tell. Obviously, we're at the early stages of the game, so that might change. We wander around some more, beat some security guards, and eventually find our informant. His lifeless body, to be precise. Upon informing our superiors, we are given orders to find some hard evidence of the Syndicate's illegal activities in the warehouse, so we carry on. The general game loop so far has been like this. You go in the general direction of where your compass leads you, explore rooms, hoping to find a terminal that unlocks doors towards your next objective, and fight enemies of different types. These enemies usually come into two sorts, those who prefer to beat you with their fists and those who shoot you on sight. It is strongly advised that you use the same fighting methods against the approaching enemies, because if you decide to shoot those of them who come at you with their fists, there's a great chance that they will suddenly unpack their gun and load an entire clip worth of bullets into your slim body, and they do it so fast that you don't even have a chance to say this game sucks. Why does it suck? Well, because when shooting is involved, ONI's frame rate tanks to single digits. This issue became much more obvious in the later chapters of the game, but boy did I make myself a disservice by deciding to play the PS2 version. Graphically, it's not offensive or anything, but the performance, bugs, and the lack of quality of life features hurt my experience with this game so much. For instance, when the game finally decided to bring some excitement to the table and asked me to run after some guard to prevent him from reaching the terminal and raising alarm, I actually managed to do that despite not being able to initiate the dash right off the bat, and punched and kicked the crap out of him. However, noticing that he had already started to meddle with the terminal, I decided, hey, I should probably deactivate it or something. This is what happened when I pressed the action button near it. What a great start. One of the game's design leads, Hardy LaBelle, summed up this game version perfectly.
For God's sake, if you're ever going to play ONI, do not play it on console. It sucks on console. I mean, Rockstar ported it in the most brain-dead way possible. They just did it in the way they possibly... I mean, they literally were just sort of like, well, let's just plug it in the most dumb way. It's horrible.
I experienced the quote-unquote brain-dead aspect of the port firsthand. Whereas the first level run relatively okay, the second one turned into a literal slideshow whenever a large hallway and 2 shooting enemies were involved. And sadly, it's not just limited to the shootouts, as this game overall is very frame rate dependent when it comes to timings of your inputs. At first I thought that my combos weren't registered due to me not pressing the buttons hard enough, or maybe that the issue is with the gamepad itself. Well, after sinking half of my poor DualShock 2's R1 button in the cavity where it sits, I figured that the problem is likely with the game. Overall, I highly recommend checking out MRIXRT's video if you're interested in the game's development history. It went through a production hell, not dissimilar to what the likes of Devil May Cry 2 experienced, where the game had to be made from scraps within a short period, and it really shows. Multiply that by the awful port efforts outsourced to a completely different developer, and you have a recipe for a commercial failure in the ever-growing market of console gaming. I mean, sure, you can still get an enjoyment out of a relatively non-linear exploration with lots of minor environmental challenges involved, but I honestly could not see the point, considering that it was barely any different from what we saw during the PS1 era of gaming. Now that I think about it, this game really feels like some jank PS1 game with a resolution and view distance bump to somewhat justify its release on a new-gen hardware of that time, and honestly, I don't mind such games. Look at Shadow Hearts. It's a PS1 game through and through, in some ways even worse than its predecessor Kodelka, which did actually release on PS1, but I still love it for its charm, bizarreness, and interesting new spins on JRPG mechanics. Now this, it's just jank with no style or charm. The best I can describe the game's feel is that it's empty. ONI has large areas, but they look barren and samey, so you don't want to hang out in them at all. At least that's the conclusion I made playing through the first 2.5 levels. Yeah, despite trying to force myself to like this game, I gave up on the 3rd level, where I entered a checkpoint with next to no health, no hyposprays, and 2 guards blocking my path to progress. I made like 15 attempts trying to pass through them, but the inconsistent hitboxes, wonky guard, and unreliable reactions to your inputs made me give up. Shooting them was not an option either, since they would unpack their bigger, more potent guns and shoot me to death much faster. I tried different strategies, different approaches, but it was all for naught, so I ended up thinking to myself, literally any moment now a drone filled with explosive can crash into my flat and kill me, and I will sure as heck not let my final moments be playing this wonky ass game, and the last human speech I hear being, "You lose!" If I want to die playing a Ghost in the Shell inspired PS2 game with a badass cyber lady cop, I don't know, maybe I should play Ghost in the Shell standalone complex instead? I definitely should have played and reviewed Ghost in the Shell standalone complex instead. Yet, somehow I still feel like I'm missing out. The game's community is active to this day, and something must have caught their imagination that they still cherish ONI. Maybe the later chapters are much more captivating with lots of twists and turns that affect our main heroine, cause in my limited playtime the game did drop some hints and foreshadowing moments that could potentially lead to something interesting. Maybe, just maybe, I didn't buy an RTX 4070 Ti Super for naught. Maybe I should play ONI on PC. So I welcome you to join me on twitch.com/Serge_Angelo, where I will be playing ONI. The stream should launch either shortly after this video's premiere, or if I have a power outage due to an old demented fart face deciding that waging wars in modern time is a good idea, you can follow me on Twitter, where I will post a stream announcement. Yes, kid, it is and it will be Twitter, no matter how much effort Elon Musk will try to shift the public's perception of the platform. With that, I thank you for your time and attention, and I'll see you when I see you.